This is the second video in a series of videos that I'm making currently about brush control. Even if that was weird, it doesn't matter. Don't have time to cut it out now. Welcome to a burst beanbag on your living room floor. As they say, once the milk is spilt, it is no longer worth crying over. And in this video, I'm going to show you a couple more techniques about brush control that I think you should know. In the last video, we discussed loading the brush and loading your brush too much versus loading your brush too little versus watering down your paints. As well as I'm going to show you a couple techniques for using those paintbrushes you thought were damaged from leaving in a water cup overnight. One of the things that I need to go over before we get more in detail about using your brush is knowing how your paints work. Every paint is different and all paints are going to behave differently. So the best thing you can do when you get a new brand or a new paint that you want to test is to test it on something that's not your favorite thing, or models that you may not be using, or even the sprues left over from your models that you cut out previously, or even the spare parts that you got from your box of intercessors and you have nothing to do with those spare hands anyway. This is the best use for them, is to test the paints that you've just recently bought and see how they behave. So for this video, I'm going to show you these three paints and how they behave. In the previous video, I explained to you the difference between water and airbrush medium or a thinner to thin your acrylic paints. I'm going to show you how I save myself some of that airbrush thinner. I take a small bottle and I take my airbrush thinner and I put a small amount in the bottle. I then fill that bottle with water. The ratio for this is not an exact science. This is just going to depend on how much you want to save that airbrush thinner. However, I tend to use roughly a quarter of the bottle and the rest is filled with water. So this helps me spread my airbrush thinner 4 times as far. As in the previous videos, I'm going to place the airbrush medium on my palette. And in a previous video, I had explained to you how my paintbrush was damaged from leaving it in the water cup overnight. As well as you can see paint up in my ferrule, and the brushes aren't exactly perfect. However, this brush is going to be perfect for what we need it for now. So we're going to be painting the gold bits around the edge of this Special Marine, and I'm going to show you how we can use this to our advantage. So, starting with the Army Painter paint. As you can see, that paint is somewhat textured. Those are the glitter particles. Some paints use actual metal for this, and thinning that down doesn't actually change how textured that paint really is. Basically, the best way to explain this is we want to catch this edge that goes along here, right? That's the main and most important part of this painting. So what we want to do is keep our brush at a flat angle towards the object, so the piece that we want to paint is over there. So we want our brush to be flat towards it. The problem is, if the brush is too loaded, what's going to happen is it's going to go over each edge. So if the brush has too much paint on it, it will paint on this side and on that side of the edge. So you want the brush to not be too loaded. As you can see, the brush doesn't have too much paint on it. There's just enough in the bristles, and we're just going to gently wipe along over the edge. Most difficult part of doing this is just making sure that the rest of the brush doesn't touch other parts on the model. But this is a super easy way to catch a raised edge without having to be precise about it. And as you can see, that is as tidy as it's going to get. And as you can see, that's a perfectly straight, tidy line. However, this is not complete. You can leave it at this level and this will still look great. However, if we want to take it to the next level, we're going to have to use a little bit more skill than that. So this time you can tell my brush is slightly more loaded than what it was before. But this time we're going to use that little hook. Can you see the hook that's there? We're going to place that over the edge of the armor. And we're going to run it along the edge just like that. That little hook is just getting over the edge of that piece so that it's not unpainted on the top. As you can tell, that's unpainted on the top and it looks great from the side. However, we want that whole part to look like it's been painted. So we're going to use this hook to our advantage. And what you'll notice is that I turn the model quite a lot in my hands. And the reason for this is because brush control is about optimal angle. So if you can get the angle of your brush right, it's going to be so much easier to handle the brush and what the brush is doing. So this first coat is with the Army Painter Gold, and I'm going to show you the difference between all three golds, just so that you can see as we do this what different paints tend to behave like and how you may have to work with them differently. So looking at this already, I can tell that I'm going to need to do 2 layers of this in order to make this be a good solid gold. As you can tell, I keep my brush exactly flat to the surface that I want to paint. This makes it really easy for me to follow the line and not go off onto other parts of the model. Keeping the brush perfectly flat against the edge is one of the tricks to controlling your brush. When it comes to edging, there is no trick other than practice, really. And I feel like for me, the main thing is keeping your hands steady and bracing yourself on the model. As you can see, I use my pinky to balance my hand and create some kind of a tripod action with my hand. And this helps me to keep the model in place while I paint that section. Same thing with going over the top here. I don't know if you noticed that, but what I do is I turn the hook to face upwards so that I've got a nice smooth edge where the tip is facing away from the model to paint an edge. And then when I need to get on the inside of it, I turn it around so that I can get to the inside. So for example, here we need to get on the inside of this. So using that piece that's bent on my tip of my brush, I'm going to use that to catch little edges that would be a little bit more difficult for me to get, and pushing the paint into the areas that I want it to go into. So even a damaged brush can actually be your best friend when it comes to something like this. So that's the shoulder pad. As you can see, that texture is in the paint. It's what makes it shiny, but the texture is very much definitely in the paint. This is the Pro Acryl from Monument Hobbies. Too much paint, way too much paint. And I'm going to show you what that does now. When you paint over the edge, for example, as you can see, the paint goes over the edges. It's a lot less controlled with too much paint on. If you look carefully on the back end of this piece, it painted over the edge. This is without too much of a loaded brush. And the edge is painted, but it didn't go over the edge on the inside of that pad there, as you can see. But on this one, with too much paint on the brush, it went over the edge. The way I like to think about painting is that it's almost like pushing the pigment around on the surface, as opposed to drawing, because the paint itself is fluid, so you can technically move it around a little bit on the surface. Again, make note of all the angles that I use my brush at. So using the brush at an angle like this allows me to place the flattest part of the brush. The paint comes off from the flattest part. That's the best deposit of paint. If you're painting on the tip, you're gonna have a really thin deposit of paint. But if you paint with the broad side of the brush, you're gonna have a nice, flat, accurate, solid paint stroke. So again, that is too much on the brush. We're gonna use this to drag some of it off, and we'll go on to the other shoulder pad. And as you can see, there's not much effort to get a decent line over a raised object. And I'm just going to use the Citadel one to do the Aquila, just so that we've got that done and we have all the gold bits done. And as you can see, the way that I use it over here, we're trying to make sure that it doesn't go off the edge. So in this case, because the edging is so small on this, we're going to keep the brush parallel to the parts, so that we're using that same technique that we used on that lining bit, but we're using it on these small little details here. As long as you don't overload your brush. If you overload your brush, it will end up going over the edges and touch the paint underneath, and we're not looking for that. We're looking just to mark the raised parts. so you don't actually need a lot of paint on your brush. It's almost like a dry brush, except it's not dry. It's a very similar technique to dry brushing. However, you're not as rough with it and you're more precise in placing the paint very specifically over the raised parts. Using the brush's edge on the edge of a fine detail will help you pick up that raised detail a lot easier. If that raised detail isn't too deep, then you can just do the edge and it will get away with it perfectly fine. If the raised detail is a little bit deeper, you're gonna have to go over the edge of that. In fact, if you have the patience and you want to get a little bit more deeper into your painting experience, then you're gonna need to go a lot more than that and then end up painting the top and each side of that raised area. This will make your model look so much tidier and so much neater. Experiment a bit and see what works best for you. These gold areas are going to need another layer of paint just to make that paint as solid as it can be before we can go on. And looking between the paints, there isn't much of a difference between all of them, to be honest. They all pretty much put down gold. They all pretty much look metallic. There isn't much of a difference between them. But looking at the palette, we can see the Monument Hobbies tends to break up quite a lot. So the Pro Acryl from Monument Hobbies has this white medium inside of it, which breaks up quite a fair amount. The one from Citadel has an orange kind of medium. And the one from Army Painter hasn't really broken up yet, but where it has broken up on the edges, it's almost a yellow kind of medium. But knowing that, we can now work with that to our advantage. So I know that the Citadel paint has an orange hue to it. And I know that the Pro Acryl has a whitish hue to it. And I know that the Army Painter has a yellowish hue to it. We can use that to our advantage when we do color picking in a future stage and we do larger models that need more thought put into the color choice process. I hope that that video at least explained to someone out there that there is a difference between sticking your brush in and angling your brush for the correct angle of attack to make sure that you don't make as many mistakes as you possibly are making just by being silly with your brush. These are the kind of things that you learn by making mistakes yourself. If someone shows you this, it already helps you to go one step further, so you don't have to make those mistakes in order to learn for yourself. So if you figured that this helped you and you think one of your friends needs to find out this information as well, then share the video with them and let them find out this secret trick that you've just learned today. Don't forget to leave a like and leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, if you would like to support the channel, create more videos in the future, we have a Patreon, which you can find the link in the description as well. I would personally like to thank the new patrons that we got this week: Joao Candias, Max Opti, Andrea Loy, Austin Scrip, and Luis Rosiles Rivera? As per usual, I've definitely butchered some of those names. Thank you so much for joining the Patreon, and make sure to jump into the Discord because you have access to a couple of channels that the Pure Muggles do not have. And once again, there's only one thing left to do when we get to this part of the video, and that's for me to tell you, click dislike and f*** off. If this doesn't help them, then God himself is going to have to come down and do it for them.